Good evening, everyone who I can't see. I'm Nicholas Monchaux, Head of Architecture here at MIT, and I extend my thanks and welcome to all of you for joining us here online for this first event of our fall 2020 lecture series. This is a strange moment and a strange way to do it, but particularly given that MIT still exists in the world as a physical place, which we are returning carefully to occupy our studios and workshops, I also want to start with another acknowledgement, which is that we honor and acknowledge the Massachusetts, the Pequot, and Wampanoag, and the many other peoples whose names are lost to history, on whose land MIT now stands. Tonight, the MIT Department of Architecture is proud to launch our fall public program, a series of conversations on where we are now. This semester, we'll be talking about systematic racism and approaches to design in Black communities. We'll talk about pandemics, inclusion in history. We'll talk about democracy and data. We'll talk about architecture and power. We'll talk about designing for resilience, the refugee crisis, and we will talk about art and slavery and vernacularism and diplomacy in an increasingly transnational yet divided world. When I arrived at MIT a few months ago, I found these conversations ongoing, and I've been happy to join them. Amidst the stresses and necessary work of the past several months in the department, and which continues, my most hopeful observation is that this community, which includes all of you tonight, is at its best a true collaboration. This word means quite literally shouldering things together. For this fall, our collaboration is involved combining our many usual lecture series into a single lecture series produced and hosted in collaboration with diverse parts of our department and supported by many staff members, and I'd like to particularly highlight Amanda Moore and Chris Jenkins. Tonight's event is co-hosted by the Design and Computation group. This lecture series is only a small part of what our community is sharing this semester. Students have helped lead us in creating new forms of programming and connection, from radio stations to online publications and film series and many other ways to connect. We're particularly grateful to them, to our faculty and staff who've helped us to build spaces of community and engagement at a time when these are so very necessary. So tonight, we're excited to launch all of these efforts with a talk from one of our distinguished alumni, Derek Ham, Associate Professor and Department Head of Art and Design at NC State's University College of Design. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Larry Sass, Director of our Design and Computation group here in the department, to give Derek his proper introduction. Before I go, I'll give you one reminder to post questions wherever you're watching on the webcast page or on Facebook. Thank you very much and welcome to Larry and Derek.
Yeah, hey, this is great to be here, and especially wonderful to be introducing a dear friend. I'm going to keep my introduction short so that he has plenty of time to talk about his work, but Derek Ham is an associate professor and department head of art design at NC State, State University College of Design. He's also founder of a new startup called Logic Grip. Make sure to say that carefully. But more importantly, Derek was a graduate of our program. He received his PhD back in 2014 working with George Steiny. And he was also a master's student at the GSD. And he managed to get his bachelor's degree from a historically Black college, Hampton University, a place that I visited a few times. And I'm very proud to know that Derek is in association with such a great university. Derek is also someone who, spans across many different disciplines. He's a really good designer. He's also someone who is really great at technology. And what's even more important, he's really a humanitarian. And design computation is really only as strong as the subjects that it deals with, whether the subjects are about architecture, art, or other areas of design. So Derek's going to show a number of projects that he has made very clear to me are grounded and based on rules and a language of design that pretty much stems from storytelling. And I can really put out a point here about storytelling in the African-American community. For many years, for centuries, African-Americans were not allowed as slaves to read. It was against the law for us to learn how to read. And so storytelling was a major part of our culture. And what's really incredible is seeing how Derek has managed to blend together storytelling and some historical components of Black culture. He's actually managed to weave them together quite nicely. His research also too deals with areas of game-based learning, algorithmic thinking, and immersive media. And I know he's going to touch on all of those. So I really want to give a warm round. I wish I had a huge applause meter here or applause device here for Derek. I'm really looking forward to his talk. I've been wanting to see this particular talk for many years. Derek, please take it away.
Oh, thank you so much, Larry. First, I just want to thank the department and the college at large for bringing me back virtually, if you will, back to MIT. It's a fond place for me because, as a lot of graduate students know, this is an opportunity to grow in a lot of different areas. And then, you know, on a personal level, 2 of my kids were born while I was studying up there. So, you know, it always feels really warm to be associated with the university, to come back. So thank you so much. Thank you to all the faculty and computation. Thank you all for having me. I'm going to share my screen right now and jump right into some of the material that I want to talk about. As Larry mentioned, this has been a little bit of a journey for me because in a lot of ways, virtual reality is now fully in its stride after the, you know, the early experiments that were happening in the 80s and so on. It was actually at my time at MIT where I got my first Oculus Rift, the Development Kit 1, the DK1, as people talk about it now, those ancient years ago, 6 years ago only, 6 or 7 years ago. All the same, what we do with this tool, for me, has evolved. And it's evolved in a lot of different ways in that it started off for me as a tool just to explore space. And I remember the first project I did in a course with Takahiko, in which we went over to northern Italy and we're looking to recreate some of the villas over there, the Palladian villas. And I remember working on a project, putting on the headset, and yes, there is that kind of natural first taking your breath away if you've never done VR. That first inclination to say, wow, I feel like I'm being transported here. I can see the materials clearly. It is definitely an outer body experience. But shortly after that project, and especially when I got down to NC State and I started thinking about what more could we do with this medium, I started thinking about the connection between not just recreating spaces, but the reader themselves. And I started thinking about the experiences that I've had with history. I started thinking about, for instance, the time when I went to Ghana and went and toured the slave castles. You know, when we talk about recreating spaces, we have to acknowledge the readers themselves are going to respond to them differently based upon their cultural lens, based upon their understanding. And so when I look to develop these VR experiences, asking first and foremost, what does it mean to read this space from these different cultural lenses? We have to take a step back and ask what our responsibility is to tell the story correctly, but also give these moments of reflection. And a lot of this work is wrapped into what we now know as digital humanities, something that has grown and has adapted VR, and I would say AR and mixed reality, but as over the last few years, the digital humanities, which has been rooted in the past with more traditional web, screen-based experiences, has now really embraced VR. And in doing so, it's opened new pipelines and new ways for collaboration to happen between cross disciplines. We're now looking at people with gaming skills, people with spatial and design skills like myself, historians, all coming together to create something. And the diagram that I like to think about is first starting with a historical investigation, you know, looking for, from my point of view, lost stories and looking at past cultures, looking at past spaces, trying to find new perspectives and new ways to shine light on that. And from that historical investigation, we translate these things. Oftentimes, some of the pieces I have, it's about filling in the gaps. There's missing components. You know, I think of myself sometimes like a paleontologist that has just one fragment of that dinosaur bone. And it's your job to then take that piece and extrapolate, well, what is the rest of the story here? And so that's done by recreating environments and sometimes scanning artifacts and completing them on the computer. Sometimes it might involve a digital performance, wearing full suits to react how people would behave in those periods of time. And then last but not least, the dissemination factor. And dissemination for me is really important because for years in academia, we've been fighting hard to have other ways to disseminate our work, to have the same type of respect we've seen in other forms of disseminating our work. And I think about the work that has been done over the years for films even to be celebrated in the academic world, the same way we would a book, the same way we would have a paper in a journal. So now we're starting to have discussions about if we're going to put the rigor in creating a project that's on a VR or AR and disseminate in that platform, why not give those things the same attention that we've been giving some of these other traditional forms of media? So the bulk of what I want to talk about really are lessons learned, and one key piece that I've worked on in the last few years. I've done several other VR projects, and I'll even end tonight with showing you a couple of preview slides of when I'm actively starting in the first phases on. But the core, a lot of my pieces, I learned most from one project I did called I'm a Man. And I Am a Man really stems as a conversation right as we were starting to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. When you think about that for a moment, only 50 years ago, we forget sometimes that these events related to civil rights really aren't that so far ago. Now, I'm sure if you're an 18-year-old freshman or a 19-year-old sophomore, even some of the undergrads that I teach, it does seem like ancient history. But it's not for your parents, it's not for your grandparents. And so this idea that we're revisiting this moment in this kind of immersive way for me was special in that it was capturing the story that often people did not know about. Now, very few people, when I began early on this project, polling students and talking to people about the assassination of Dr. King, very few people knew the details. Well, why was he in Memphis? And what was so special about that place? And why was he assassinated? What was his mission at that time? They know the March on Washington. They know that he was assassinated at some point. Some people didn't even know the city. And so I felt focusing the story on the I Am a Man movement, which was about the civil rights and the sanitation workers strike, was really important because once again, it completed the story that goes beyond just Dr. King's death. And so it was really fortuitous that I was thinking about this and I reached out to the National Civil Rights Museum and said, you know, this is a great opportunity. I'm working on an idea here. I had some backing from Oculus themselves, and I wanted to put the pieces together and work with them as historians to tell the story in a way that was true to the historical events, but also shed light on a couple of areas that a few people did not know. When I start these projects, I look at what do I have? What do we have first to go off of? The Civil Rights Museum in Memphis still holds the original facade of the Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was slain. It still holds the original facade, and they use really special about museums that are attached to the physical place in history, right? You know, if we go to the African American Museum in the Smithsonian in DC, a beautiful museum has a lot of beautiful artifacts. If you think about it spatially, these artifacts have been imported there into that museum. But some place like this, like the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, it's special because not only does it hold the stories, not only does it have artifacts related to civil rights, but this location, the geographic location in itself is a living point in time. The museum, if you will, in itself is an artifact. And when I traveled to Memphis, you know, it's hard to explain. It's very similar to, as I explained about going to the slave castles in Ghana. But when you travel to this museum, and I stepped out of my car and began to walk up the street, and you see the Lorraine Motel, and you see the balcony, I had an emotional response. And talking to the museum curators and talking to the historians there, they've told me tons of stories of people breaking down crying, just not even going into the museum yet. So there's something about the hallowed nature of being in a space and being in a location where these events happened. And I asked myself, well, what do we need to do to translate some of these things into a virtual environment? And I think about going beyond pictures. When you look at a picture like this and you see people pointing, you have to sometimes take a step back and realize that every single person in this picture has a story. You know, we're so used to thinking if a Hollywood lens in which we focus on the key players. You know, Dr. King is slain, laying right there on the balcony. And oftentimes in a film, that's the main character. That's what we focus on. And everyone else becomes like an extra. But when I begin to look at the photos, it's no longer treating these individuals like extras. It's really looking at each person and identifying and saying, this person has a story. That soldier on that truck has a story. The African-American soldier in this picture who's holding the weapon and is in conflict between doing his duty as a soldier, but then feeling disconnected with the community now that he's asked to hold with his bayonets raised. Each of these people have stories. And so I wanted to ask, how could we use the immersive technology to break down into a human level, all right? A human level of experiencing these events and seeing them play out in a way that brings life to them. When we look at a documentary, when we look at the recreation of events like this, for instance, the movie Selma, there's still a disconnect. You watch it from the screen, you're over here and the screen's in front of you. But what I was interested in is how can we close that gap in the same way in which we actually visit the museum? The gap is closed. I'm now in the space, breathing the same air, if you will, that Dr. King breathed. Seeing these places up and close, we have a lot to learn. And that's where I begin to start thinking about developing these virtual environments. Another note I should mention about the museum, which is really heavy, is that they deal with dark subjects in an interesting way. They don't color the whole story and present it in a nice, beautiful bow. They show you the ugliness even of history. And in this photo here, you see a top view of the Civil Rights Museum. But what people don't know until they actually go there or read up about it is that the museum is split into two buildings. On the right, I've highlighted the small square. It's a part of the balcony that's now, that facade of the Lorraine Motel is embedded into the museum. But across the big red square, that's the apartment where James Earl Ray, the accused shooter, took the shot and took Dr. King's life. And so the museum preserved the assassinator, where the assassination took place, and also the hired gunman himself in the bathroom, in the tub. It's all there staged. And so that presents an interesting kind of even approach for us to think about creating historical moments, that it's not our duty to try to colorize it and sugarcoat it. You know, we tell history as it is, the events that happened around Room 306, but also expanding to the broader conversation about civil rights at large. And if you go to the museum, you'll see it's very common, their physical immersive way of bringing you into these stories, using full-scale sculptures and using the signage and embedding it with information. It's definitely a place, if you've never been to Memphis, you should definitely go to the museum and check it out. But in working with them and collaborating with them, we said, how can we take these experiences, these stories, and bring it into a virtual environment? And before I begin to transition into the technical aspects of recreating it in VR, I'll also zoom in here and show that the room where Dr. King stayed, room 306, is still kept to this day. And it's staged. There are some differences, things that are here. But this was a critical thing for me to be able to observe, because this was in a lot of ways just a true litmus test to know, you know, if this room is preserved, and I'm going to put us in a virtual reality headset, we want to make sure that it's being as true as what we see in this staged environment. Every dish, every milk carton, every newspaper, running it through, asking ourselves, are we being true to the true historic event without being able to go in there and scan it? And so here's a screenshot of that same room in the Unreal Game Engine. And this project was built in Unreal. Some students always ask me, from a technical lens, do you prefer the Unreal game engine or Unity or another third-party way of building these things? And I tell them, you learn all of them, and it really depends upon the story you're trying to tell, and even sometimes the proficiency of your team. This one, I didn't have a team. It was a long crawl of myself building it. But all the same, you could see what you're able to do in recreating an environment in what's traditionally thought of as a gaming engine, right? But only now are we starting to see tools like this and this rendering here from the Unreal game engine in ways in which I'm trying to appropriate the tool to tell these stories and to use them in broad different ways. What I love about this experience from a developer point of view, it does allow you to take these things back and sit in experience. I was talking to another VR developer, and I was shocked to see that we do the same thing. Often when you build these spaces, you spend several hours just sitting in the space, observing, taking it in, finding the details, making sure it feels true. There's a version of this project that it was even pre-beta, in which I went all the way and was able to sit in this room. I put an avatar of Dr. King in the space just to kind of soak it in. What would it be like to be in the room with him? I programmed the phone to ring. Several events that you'll never experience it in the final project, but for me, it began to anchor me in the story and anchor me in the space in a tangible way, with the television running, with the phone ringing, with Dr. King, an avatar built in the space to make this come to life. And those are the kind of the ways in which it's the first wave of making it truly fully immersive. But the second thing I bring note to is, unlike any other form of media, we have the ability to transport people into the skin of someone else. This is a really different approach as opposed to documentary, film, even traditional video games. This, unlike any other form of media, requires you to take a step back and ask, well, what does it mean to be embodied in this experience? Now, at the time I'm building I Am Man, there's several of the projects that began to also kind of push the boundary in this topic. The 1,000 Cut Journey, a colleague that I know over in Columbia, Dr. Courtney Cogburn, Being Homeless by Jeremy Bailenson at Stanford University, and even the project Clouds Over Cedra. Even though it's not immersive and it's a 360 video, it's immersive, but doesn't have the tactile agency of using your hands. All these projects are often talked about together because they all were trying to do one big thing: put you in the skin, ask, what does it mean to feel like you're homeless? What does it mean to feel in the 1,000 Cut Journey? What is it like to go through the adolescent years as a young Black youth in the school system? Clouds Over Cedra, what does it mean to actually be a refugee in a camp? And Chris Milk coined the term, the idea of VR as an empathy machine. And I struggled with that term for a while, and I understand what Chris Milk was trying to say, the ultimate empathy machine. But I would critique that statement and say, well, VR is the ultimate empathy tool. And the reason I use the word tool as opposed to machine is because oftentimes when we think of machine, we think it does the work for you. It's almost as if, hey, I'm a racist, I'm gonna put a headset on, I'll think differently about underrepresented minorities. Or I'm a misogynist, hey, I'm gonna put a headset on, I'm gonna think differently about gender. Well, it doesn't work that way. And we all know it doesn't work that way. But when we use the word tool, it becomes something that you have to do, right? You have to then now take it on yourself to actually go there. So if you're using this as an empathy machine, all right, the tool word is better because it requires you to do some work. And that's where I like to land. And another major voice on this I was really thinking about was the voice of Jeremy Bailenson. And he writes this notion that, when we experience these types of virtual experiences, on one level, yes, we have a quick reflex encounter. We respond with the suffering of others the same way. You might grimace, you'll have a bodily response to things that you might see. There's a second kind of wave on this where you begin to really think a little bit more beyond your initial response. What is it like to be that person? What are they feeling? What caused those feelings? But I love the idea that there's this third there. And Dr. Zaki points it out, this notion of full-fledged empathy, this idea that when you have some type of experience that you now have a desire to alleviate the suffering of that person, or a desire to go much deeper. Now, I put these up here reflectively, thinking about this, not knowing fully how this would play out as I was developing I Am a Man. And it was the embodiment of using Black hands, something that for me, I thought was very simple, that began to be a triggered response to most of the people who've tried I Am a Man. You know, I've seen people in tears from this experience. I've seen people frozen just to look down to see the hands that I frankly have every day. And it's something like that, you know, this embodiment, asking you to be someone else just for, in this case, 15 minutes, could begin to alter and rewire just a little bit of how you think about history and how you think about people as they go through the world. There's no escaping when you do a virtual experience like this, like you could look away from a film, because you become that subject. Now, people sometimes ask, well, you know, what does your architectural education have to do in how you approach VR? And for me, it's been everything, because most of VR is about creating a spatial language, moving through a virtual environment. And one of the things that I use, and I put this slide together, is when I teach my students about VR, I talked about this idea of rhythm, spatial rhythm. All right, we can call it rules, we can call it a schema, this idea that there should be a language, right? And you should begin to build rules based upon the spatial conditions that you have in a virtual environment. I've seen too many times VR experiences where they haven't broken it down, they did not break it down rather, in a way to have this type of diversity of space throughout the experience. So you see on the left-hand corner, this idea of being in a big open environment, the idea of being up high, lifted on the plateau is what I call that. And the third there, I call it the mountaintop, this idea of being in a really high place. The same thing with the middle layer here, this idea of changing the diversity of how close and tight you are. This is very claustrophobic, like being in a closet and something really tight, to opening those walls up or raising those ceiling. And then even the narrow spaces, these narrow, tall spaces. And then even when we start talking about things that are open to the sky, once again, these things are parametric in a way. And what I tell my students, what you have to do is take that same type of language, spatial conditions, if you will. You could throw on their lighting conditions, you could throw on their sound conditions, and all of a sudden you begin to have almost like notes on a page where you can say, well, what's your targeted emotion? What are you trying to do in the scene in VR, and begin to play with these things? Okay, let's raise those, alter those. Not, it's a dial. I start spinning the dial in the spatial conditions, spinning the dial in the lighting conditions, playing with the sound. I should put a star by sound, because even the work that I do, there are moments when we use natural sound versus we use musical scores. So all these things become almost like dials that we can turn up, turn down, which can further evaluate a project. Something that for me was very natural. This is for me setting up a system, a language of rules. And I've talked to other developers who don't do that. And I find it interesting that they're developing every scene uniquely. And so I say, let's take a step back, create a rhythm, create a language, and then you can begin to just play this game, if you will, playing with the spatial conditions, playing with the lighting, and playing with the sound. And always thinking about almost like a formula. Well, what are those things? How do they combine together to reach that target emotion? Giving it to a play test, going through the playable actions and user experience to confirm the formula that you're creating for that unique scene. Here's
and treat them as though they are not men. That's a racist point of view. And no matter how you dress it up in terms of whether or not a union can organize, it's still racism. For at the heart of racism is the idea that a man is not a man, a person is not a person. So the racism has been obvious, it seems to me, from the very beginning of this whole matter.
Who seems to be the spokesman for the union and a former sanitation employee worker, he said he had no comment at this time.
The Lorraine Hotel. Dr. King was shot as he stood on the second floor balcony.
Each one of these scenes probably has 3 or 4 other drafts where I've played those dials, where this first scene that I established, this idea of starting off as a sanitation worker and the truck pulls back. A little note that I'll add about this scene, with that truck coming to you and you're in VR and seeing people sometimes kind of like shudder and say, oh my goodness, is a truck gonna back up on me, even though it's coming super slow, was my little nod to film history. And if you know a little bit about film history, that first piece with the train coming through and the rumors, the audience kind of freaked out because they thought the first time seeing the train coming through on the cinema was going to crush them. I was my little nod to that because several people, I'm a Man was the first VR experience that they've ever tried as I began to take this to several festivals and several film festivals. So starting off here, the spatial conditions, but then begin to think about even that interaction. You know, what do we want to do in each scene? When I start thinking about interacting with these kind of spatial elements, I think about Dr. Turkle's work, and when she talks about these idea of the evocative objects, objects we love, objects we think with. And it's interesting that in each of these scenes, there is something to touch, there is something to grab, and I made sure that was part of my formula. Each scene should have something to interact with, and it's very intentional. You know, you can't grab the chair, you can't grab the ashtray, but you can grab those newspapers. And so I began to think about how can we constrain the world of interaction to really drive the intentional nature of what we want people to do and how we want them to feel as they touch and interact with these artifacts. And at the core of the story arc, it's, for me, is the most famous scene. It's the men walking by with the signs of I am man. And once again, you know, it's this idea that we want to give the sensation that these are real people. They're rooted, they're grounded, they each have a story. And as one of my friends likes to say, you make it as if we're breathing the same air. And we don't get that from photos, and we don't get that from documentaries and film, but virtual reality has opened up a new window to kind of bring us into these moments in history. With the Lorraine Motel, that was a really interesting, for me, the most one-to-one skill set of my previous life in doing recreation of pure architecture. And because of Lorraine Motel, I had the most data on the scale of the building, still having old blueprints, footprints of the actual site. But there were some things that were missing. There were certain things that I only discovered when looking in the photographs, such as the swimming pool. You go to the Lorraine Motel today, they keep the front facade, but the office and the swimming pool are elements that only in talking to the historians there did I know were such critical components. The swimming pool, if you think about it, and as it was presented to me, made the Lorraine Motel one of the, you know, a top tier hotel in Memphis at that time. At this time, they were still very much segregated in the way you traveled across the country. And some of you probably have heard of something called the Green Book, a book that told motorists who were African-American where they could stay safely and which hotels wouldn't kick them out. And you can imagine even the idea of a swimming pool in the hot, sticky summers of Memphis, that this was a top tier. This is a top tier hotel. So Dr. King wasn't staying in this kind of ratty hotel on the other side of town. You know, he was staying in the best for Black America at the time, with a swimming pool and all. So even playing with the swimming pool, bringing those elements back, reading off the photos, some of the old techniques of counting bricks, finding the heights of things to measure and put those things in place, was for me very satisfying to kind of bring those elements when we don't see them there today. And there's some things you just learn when you do projects like this. When I did it, it was really focused about telling history, and putting it in the store really began to see a real-time public response that mirrors a lot of what we see just in the world today, where on one spectrum, people will look at the historical telling of a piece like this and call it a liberal agenda to promote racism and to exacerbate the history of Black people in America. It's an interesting approach. And then right after that, someone would call this a poignant experience that puts history into your hands. And so for me, when I saw these comments, it's like, this is great. The tool is actually working better than what I expected. I didn't know putting history in this way could elicit, you know, such a visceral response to this, calling it this person saw the experience and took time to get on the comment page and call it an agenda to promote racism. So this lets us know that this is a tool that we need to continue to investigate over the next couple of years as we see more projects like this come out. And this project also presented what I called the most unexpected appropriation of its use. And one day, out of the blue, I received an email from an organization that asked, could we use I Am a Man for something in which they would allow community members and police officers to have a deeper dialogue about race, about history, and about the communities that they live in. And it was presented to me by our Dr. Alexandra Ivanovich from Equality Labs, who's been looking into the subject for several years now. And she created a small pilot study in which police officers were asked to go through the experience of I'm a Man. And community members, they went through an experience called Dispatch by the VR development group Here Be Dragons. And it was something interesting to see when we stopped and people were able to experience something outside of themselves. With Dispatch, you get a first-person perspective, even though it's done abstractly, of what it's like to answer and go to the scene after answering from a 911 call. It's very rich experience. So we think about giving people the opportunity, as I said before, a tool, not a machine, to take a step back and see, well, what is the lens through which this other person sees the world? What is the lens through which this other person experiences space? What is the lens through which this person sees history? And that's what this project was all about. I had the ability to see this in person with this workshop in several different stages. And one of them was even my hometown here in North Carolina, and at the Raleigh Police Department, where the chief of police asked her whole leadership team to come to NC State to go through I'm a Man, to foster that conversation. And when I began to talk with the officers and I talked with the chief of police, the word that kept on coming up was this idea of trust. How do we establish trust between the community? How do we establish trust between the officers and the community? And trust goes both ways. But one of the things that came out of this exercise for them, and they were moved emotionally in a lot of different ways, was that it gave them insight to some of the historical baggage that's still burdening some of these communities that they're tasked to serve. There's one pivotal moment in I Am a Man towards the end where the officers in a cop car come on you. And these are moments right after Dr. King was assassinated and the city of Memphis was on a full curfew. And the police through the bullhorn yells to put your hands in the air. And it's a powerful moment that for a lot of people, in some cases, I've given a teaser ahead of time that this event happens because someone may have had an experience in their life that's been very traumatizing. So I learned over time to kind of give spoiler alerts about certain aspects of the experience related to, obviously, Dr. King's shooting, the scene here where the police come up on you. But these are the moments in which it doesn't completely change you, right? It's a tool. It's a tool that allows you to see the world in a different way and brings communities together through workshops and having deeper conversations after seeing something like I'm a Man to further engage in the content. You know, I'll end here on a few slides on future work. I learned a lot from I'm a Man. I learned a lot of practical things about what the public would receive and how they receive these VR pieces. And with the next piece, I decided, let's spread it out a little bit. You know, dealing with civil rights through the lens of the sanitation workers is very heavy. It's very emotionally tasking. But this time, we're taking a broader look and looking at the story of Negro League Baseball. It's a project that, once again, partnering with a museum, in this case, the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City, funded by Epic Games with their mega grant. And I do like to say I love the fact that I get to work in North Carolina, Cary, North Carolina, where my home is home to one of Epic's big bases. So it's really good to continue to work on the Unreal game engine with them. Obviously, the company that's a spin out of my lab, Logic Grip, and Real Illusion, a different tool that allows you to really build avatars in a powerful and engaging way. And so together, we're working on a project called Barnstormers Determined to Win. It's a project that looks at the civil rights from the lens of Negro League baseball and looking at all the associated issues related to a time when the talent of these great players were not allowed to play in the Major League Baseball. And as the title Barnstormers comes to play, there are moments when these players were able to tour around the country. And what was really powerful was that they began to tour with both Major League and Black players together. So in a lot of ways, it was an ambassador program showing the nation, this is what it looks like for Black and white people to get along, playing a game of baseball. And so what's interesting about this project is there's a lot of different components coming together beyond the companies that are backing it and getting together. We're using a peripheral device that we developed and had patented out of our lab at NC State, a tool that we've been working with to kind of give the sensation of what it's like to lock your hands in place with VR. The process of making these environments is very much similar to some of the historical recreations that we've done in the past. A lot of these stadiums either don't exist or in such a dilapidated manner that we really are taking these tools and going through the process of recreating these great stadiums so that when you're there on the field from that advantage, it's accurate. It's, once again, giving the rigor to recreate the space, to give you the sensation of what it's like to be transported back in history. And someone asked me, what's about the lights? They're like, they had lights for the field in that time. A really interesting fact about Negro League Baseball, they were the first to use night lights, and the first night light baseball game was through the Negro Leagues. So we'll be exploring the lives and stories of some of the great players, Gibson, Doby, Satchel Paige, and others, bringing them to life using these tools, and telling a story that, once again, arcs through the amazing journey that a lot of these players went through. Even the patriotism that many Black baseball players, and even in the community, serving our country in World War II, only to come back to be marginalized and told they still couldn't play in the majors, or told they still had to play, put in their place in society, dealing with the Jim Crow South. So we'll be exploring on the field action, we'll be exploring off the field, we'll be exploring the spaces recreated, all these components coming together in a way that we've never done with VR. Each project we do, we push it a little bit further, we learn a little bit more, and we continue to do these things together. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Derek, for your talk. It's really, I can't think of a more relevant talk for the difficult times, we're going through, continuing the battle for social injustice, but also, your talk brings again the theme of closing the gap of space and time, and that's also relevant to the social distancing we experienced through the pandemic. I'd like to remind everyone to post questions on either Facebook or webcast, and we'll try to address as many of them as we can. So until people start posting, I'll take the opportunity to ask a few questions that I have. And it was great to, I've heard a lot of the work when it was first out, and it's great to, see your personal perspective now on the talk. I was interested in one of your interviews. It was, I think, the journal Outline in 2018. You talk about how you first designed the scene of the assassination very, very much detail, and how you were able to give very strong emotions, and the idea of empathy comes again and again in your talk. And I found it interesting that you said that you decided actually to remove the user of the scene and actually take a step back and see it from a distance. Yeah. And you said that would be more respectful for the people that actually had the spatial memory. So I'm thinking the VR it's a great tool to like create empathy, but at the same time, it gives you this responsibility to decide where do you put the boundary, like in privacy and public matters. Like how do you take decisions about respect or what you think is disrespect? And I'd like you to talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's this idea that sometimes if we're not careful, we can sensationalize historical events. And definitely the assassination of Dr. King, it took a lot of time to finally get to the solution that we went with. And just to kind of piggyback on what you said, so the very first version that of I'm a Man, of being at the Lorraine Motel, it was programmed, and I'll tell you in detail, with the assassination, hearing the shot, seeing Dr. King fall back, everyone's responding, and in a very gory way, I have to say. And then, you know, to make matters worse, there was another version in which we scripted the shot so you couldn't anticipate when the shot was going to happen. And that was even more jarring because you're sitting there at the Lorraine and you're like, if you know your history, you know it's going to happen, you don't know, and all of a sudden, you know, randomly, boom, it happens. And in play testing that with a few people, it was decided that this was just too much at this time because, you know, VR is it's so real for certain people who there becomes a dampening of the realness. The more you go into VR, the more you get used to the medium. But a big population, this is the first VR experience, and so making the decision to not be as graphic but still tell the story led me to really think about how theater works and how other genres work. And it was a theater trick that happened. We in the project, the lights begin to dim, and completely when it's blacked out, that's when you hear the ringing shot happening right behind your head as if it happened right from the alley. And that still is jarring, but it's not in a way, for instance, to actually match vision with audio. So once again, playing with those kind of rule systems, like, okay, if we turn down the darkness and punch up the sound, do we still get something? And that's where, after play testing it with a few people and even discussing it with the museum itself, you know, that was the solution. And who knows where VR will be in the next 5 to 10 years. Maybe we'll get to a point where there's enough people who have tried it, who are used to the medium, that will begin to see things. But if you look at some of the other VR projects that deal with deep history like this, for instance, I'm thinking about a project centered around the Holocaust. And the Holocaust is not a recreation. It's a spatial journey. And I love that. And you go through the concentration camp. There's no one there. It's not a recreation. There is one tour guide who is a Holocaust survivor, and he tells a story as you walk through. And that's enough. You know, the space tells the history in that experience. So I learned from other pieces. I really stand by the decision that we made to do it that way. And at the end, it has still moved people without having to be kind of grossly real in those types of moments in time.
It also made me think that, like, even though you want to put the user in the place of, like, you know, who do you want to put the user in? Because I mean, there are only few people writing the scene. So you don't want to put them right like in the skin of Martin Luther King. You want to put it in like a person that was there. So, you know, that I think that's like very interesting. I'll ask one more question while I see like people posting. You mentioned, you know, like the rules and how like you tweak the rules to kind of like to fit the emotions and experience you wanted. And, you know, I know your work, like from your PhD, that was a lot of like playful calculation and safe grammars. You also mentioned that in your presentation. I was thinking, how like does this different dimensions of rules play? Because one is like the shape transformations, then you have like the shapes mapping to emotions, like the sounds, like many different levels of senses and things to map with. And like, how do you actually like come up with more concrete rules, or is it more like guidance?
You know, there's two classes that stand in my mind when I think about those rules that came together. One, obviously, is George's class that really deals with shape grammars, but the other was a visualization class that Takahiko used to teach, and I don't know if he still teaches it, but I remember there was a moment when we would watch a film, a Hitchcock film, and just the changing of the audio gave a completely different reading on the scene. And that's something that they've been doing in film for years. And at the end of the day, it's embedding, right? It's this idea that when you put two things together, you know, you're able to see the emergence of something brand new. So just like the men walking down the street, there's a version of it where you just hear footsteps and you hear the ambient noise. There's another moment when I did a version of it where it's an audio track, which was ended up being the release of it with the audio track. But each of those things, it's a beautiful game. It's about putting those things down as a designer, laying them out and seeing what emerges by the overlaps and seeing by the embedding of those senses, as you're saying, what you hear, what you see, and then even with your tactility, what you can pick up, then those are the moments when new things emerge. And they emerge not in a way that's just kind of one-to-one, like binary, no, different people, it's just like shape grammars. You can see different things, you get different readings. So when people come out the headset, I love when I would take it on tour to different festivals, the conversations I had with people, what did you see and experience when you came out of it? So what I like to do with a piece like this, and this is what I also explain to developers about the future of VR content in whole. When there's a big industry push just to do shooting, swords, this very action-packed run through these worlds. But, you know, when we take a step back and really craft, as my diagram showed, unique spaces and really craft sounds and audio, it doesn't matter what you're doing, you're providing a more tapestry to get more readings out of the experience. So everyone comes out of it and they can see and experience different things depending upon how those are layered and how you read them. So it has been great to kind of work in that space and kind of bring that pedagogy to my approach in VR.
So we have like a question asking how do people access iArmorman? Like, is this like is this like online somewhere, or is there an access to it?
Right. So it was released in the Oculus Store in 2018. So if you have an Oculus Rift, you can experience that. But we are almost ready to release a version of it in 360 video format. And so I've been working hard on kind of translating it to 360 because what it will do is have a broader audience. You could use YouTube for 360. That has not been publicly released yet. I'm still working on a couple of things and even having a conversation with the museum, respecting them because they were the original partner. How would we want to release it in this way? That is the challenging thing for me in the release of it as a 360 is that you lose a very critical component, and that's hand agency. Anyone that's been on YouTube and seen these 360 experiences, whether they use a Google Cardboard headset, use it on the screen, or even use something like an Oculus, as soon as we're in this 360 film, you lose that component. And so I'm even thinking about how to frame the experience and how to communicate to the public, how it's been reprocessed for 360 and why we decided to do that versus a complete release. The ideal way you'd want to experience it is on the Oculus Rift headset.
Since you got more into the technical, someone's asking if you could speak briefly about your workflow, number of team members, how and who makes assets, translations from historical source materials to 3D model, and like how do you work with who? And
right.
What's the work?
Well, I Am a Man was, hopefully I'll never have to do it that way again. It was a 10-month long gruel, self-developed and self-published. And as I said, that was a long gruel. They don't have time to dedicate to do a project like that. Right now, I have about 7 team members working on the Barnstormers project. And I truly feel this time I'm working on it in a very efficient way, where I have team members who are just working on creating the historic baseball players. So I have character teams, and they're just like poring over the photographs and doing the same type of work you would see in a Hollywood approach of recreating a digital avatar of a character. Using the Real Illusion tools, they have a lot of great plugins that we can use to really capture skin textures and a lot of different things of how we want to nail those players. And the hardest thing to do when you do a piece of recreating a photorealistic character, such as a baseball player, people change over time. You know, my kids laugh at me when they see a picture of me, what I look like in my 20s or even in my teens. And with Negro League Baseball, you have some of these players who started at 18, 19, and they played all the way. Satchel Paige is the oldest player to ever play the game, and he played well into his 40s. So this question about, you know, when you find a photo, there's a discrepancy about, okay, well, what year do we want to model this person? The young version, the old version, what version? So have a team just working on character creation, have a designer just working on the baseball stadiums. And you saw a slide of that, just really finding the blueprints if we can, finding the maps. We call museums, we source as much data as we can. Sometimes, even with I'm a Man, I had to purchase certain photos from Getty, and that's a big process of how do you use photos and how you get access to them. Some were given, and some you have to get access. So right now, it's a huge endeavor from rebuilding spaces to rebuilding characters. And in this time, because there's going to be more engagement with I'm a Man, you never engage with a character. It's driven by space. You're in scenes with characters, but for the most part, it's more reflective. This one, you're going to engage with Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, some of these players, as much as you engage with these architectural spaces. So I have one student who's just pouring through, giving a glossary of the types of slang terms that were used by players on the field. And what did these terms mean, and how did they speak, and what was their catch type of phrases, and what you know, everything to then be churned into a script to kind of work out. Our pipeline includes a motion capture suit. You know, we use I think it's called the Neuron, I forget the full technical term. My students know it better than me, but we use the full motion capture suits, and we're looking to partner with, potentially, keeping my fingers crossed, with even players from our NC State baseball team to kind of go through the actions of those characters and think about how a pitching style today is even different than the pitching style from the 1950s and 40s. So, you know, as I tried to put in the presentation, this is not about kind of having some thought in your head of, oh, I have an idea to tell a story, it's completely fiction. If these are based on historical events, we are as thorough as possible about the movements, about the words, about the spaces that we can possibly be. There's a lot of rigor in recreating a historical moment in time, going beyond just recreating the historical spaces.
Indeed. So I have a question by Bjorn Sparman, ACT alum from architecture. He asks, going back into the social impact on the tool, he asks, maybe can you explain a bit your thoughts on the relation or role of VR computational tools for public discussion? Do we need to go far into technology to connect with others? Does access to media and VR play into divides of inequality or overcome?
I'm gonna try my best to answer some of these things, and I'll try my best to answer this idea of connecting with people and even social justice and technology. So there's a lot of people who are trying to paint interacting in VR environments as this new utopian space. Like, hey, we'll get in VR, we'll build together, we'll create spaces together, we'll do all this. And unfortunately, most of the experiences I've had, even on Facebook's new pilot Project Horizon, I feel that I've seen people bring their own baggage from the physical world to the digital. You know, if you're a jerk in the physical world, I see people being jerks in the digital. And if anything, the being anonymous and enabling you to recreate yourself has sometimes even made things worse. the whole representation of self is a really interesting thing. I was on a committee with a PhD student who she was studying the representation of avatars in virtual environments and what they mean, you know, when you choose gender, when you don't choose your gender, when you choose an amorphous character versus choosing things that look closer to yourself. And that literature is still being produced right now, not just by her, but several people, about how do we conduct ourselves. But we can look at the behavior patterns of people in World of Warcraft and some of these mass multiplayer online environments. Being in an immersive is not going to change anything. If anything, it's making us create more rules and having to create more kind of enforced buttons that you can mute someone and delete people and things like that. So I challenge the idea of, hey, if we're all in VR, we can just have a beautiful social presence and actually know how to behave, and we'll work collaboratively and work together. I think at the end of the day, it's a tool, all right? And so the communities who use a tool will set the rules and use it a certain way. And that's the best we can hope for it. We cannot call this a machine that's going to uniquely change us or change our behaviors and bring us together. It's a tool, whether you design it for the intention to give empathy or the intention to work together, it is just a tool. And so that's my take on that.
Yeah, and that's like the case for most or all of the technological tools, you would say. I can see like the great benefits like it has on empathy. Did you see any like shortcomings or like maybe negative like outcomes that you didn't like expect or in the behavior of the user?
Yeah, when you deal with a younger audience, that's a really interesting thing that I was able to see. And that was part of the reason why the Barnstormers project is what it is related to baseball as it relates to civil rights, because it's hard for a young audience. When I say young, I'm thinking between around the ages between 10 to 12, all the way up to around 14. They're not as reflective. So I cringe sometimes when for instance, there's a scene when you're on the street and you can pick up one of the I'm a Man signs, and older generations are moved. They sit, some have cried, they hold the signs, and you see some teenage young kid, middle school kid, pick up the sign and start acting like a sword player and start like trying to slice the marchers as they walk by. And, you know, at the end of the day, you have to say, well, one, they're a kid, right? And they're more engrossed with the technology at large than the story that's playing. But then I started thinking more about, well, why did that kid decide to do that? And why weren't they in reverence? Well, one of the reasons, they had no role. They didn't know what to do. So with the Barnstormers project, it's interesting because it's going to have the outlet. You're a baseball player, so you'll have that outlet to get some of your VR action in. But then when you're off the field and you deal with some of the Jim Crow signs and deal with some of that, hopefully that cadence, and it'll be interesting to test this on that kind of middle school, high school market to see, is there a balance now kind of in what's the expectation that you have for VR? What do you want to do in VR? And we just found that I'm a Man was, for the most part, very slow for that age group. But for the adults, and especially older, it was appropriate. So it's just something that we learn as all VR developers when we start thinking about your audience.
Right. And do you see now, like, you know, with the pandemic, like, more and more people talk about VR as a tool to like close the gap of that kind of like physical distancing. Do you like see your work like, you know?
And it's not just people, it's organizations. I've had more conversations with museums themselves, talking with me about how can we translate our collection, what we have, into a narrative or onto VR. The pandemic has hurt a lot of our institutions, a lot of our museum institutions, especially some of these smaller ones. The Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, it's a pretty decent size, but by no means has the scale of what we find in the Smithsonian in DC, as well as smaller museums like there's a sit-in museum in Greensboro. So there's a lot of smaller scale museums that have beautiful stories that need to be told, but the COVID has really closed their doors and shortened scaled down their audiences. And so over the next couple of years, I think storytelling, museums that have certain stories to tell and artifacts, they're now interested in translating their experiences to VR, to AR, and even more web-based things, so that what the museum is, what they hold, is not narrowed down to having just to be there at the physical space. So we're just going to see hopefully a lot of more institutions do those types of translations. And the one thing I always tell every museum when I talk to is like, this is not about doing a walkthrough of your museum in VR. No one really wants to do that. It's more like use it as an interpretive tool. Tell the story. If you have an artifact, use VR to tell the story about the artifact. Don't just put us in a virtual space to look at things behind glass again. Why do you even need the glass? We can pick these things up. We can interact with them. So I've had an increased demand in the conversations I've had with museums. And so I just think we're going to see more and more, at least that environment increase.
Talking about virtual versus physical space, I have a question here, like a little bit provocative towards the architecture field, that says, your project managed to address some of the deepest challenges in our society in ways that architecture hasn't found a way to do. What could we learn from VR? And I would like kind of frame it more in the discipline, saying like, do you see like, for students that study architecture and thinking of become more like professionals, like in designing buildings and so on. How do you think the VR tools and education through I know you don't teach architects, but like still like designers that design on physical.
No, I mean,
what do you think they come out, like what are the benefits of working with VR as a tool for learning?
Yeah, I spent a whole life in architecture. So it's like, once you study it and you're there, it's always a part of you. I remember being on a jury at a school that it wasn't MIT, so I won't throw them underneath the bus. And I was on a jury, architecture studio, and the studio was focused on a community that was predominantly African American, and I was in the brief, and we talked about that. And the renderings that were presented, all of the characters were, even though they were silhouettes, they were white. And someone had and I pointed that out, and they said, they're silhouettes. I'm like, yes, they're silhouettes, but you can still see that they're white. Look at the shape of look at their hairstyles. Look at everything that you see in the representation of them. You can't take a white character and just put them mass black and say all of a sudden, oh, they're silhouettes, so they're agnostic. I said, if anything, why didn't they actually do the work? Because it's a community of underrepresented minorities and Black community, why didn't they find Black characters or make Black characters a stock and put them into space? And the other critic rebutted against that and said, well, it's about the space at the end of the day. Those are just placeholders. So there's a disconnect between the design student and even that faculty member really deepening their thought about not just designing for a Black community or underrepresented minority community. What does it mean to be that person and be in that community? I have several stories like that when there became a disconnect in truly understanding the lens in which you see your project. So I think that's a wonderful opportunity to pause to say, if you're serving an underrepresented community, what does it mean to be Black in America? Like, you have to ask those types of questions if you have a project that's dealing with those types of communities. And even if it's not intentionally dealing with those communities, we have to have this holistic way of embodying an empathetic view of the people we say we're designing for. And we see it across ad agencies and architecture and so many different disciplines related to design, where there's blinders up. There's blinders up, and they make these horrible decisions and horrible mistakes, all because they didn't slow it down and look at it through the lens of someone else. So I think there's a wonderful moment for VR to begin to enable people to see things from different views, different angles, create experiences, allow people from different cultures to see their spaces, let them talk freely, annotate these things, even as a research tool, collecting data and putting people in one-to-one spaces and asking them, give us the feedback. What do you see in these spaces? What are your thoughts? like this could be one of those tools that begin to open up the world beyond this traditional jury looking at these little models in a room full of frightened students. But let's open it up and get more data from the world about what you're building.
That's right. And in the end, when you present, like, even if you present like a house, you present a narrative, right? And many studios already are using VR tools. So it's developing the narrative, like, as you do, would like change the game. So I have like a personal question. Your work boldly crosses disciplines that are not often connected or valued. What is the biggest risk that you have taken in your academic career, and why?
All right, I'll be very transparent. One of the
Okay.
One of the biggest challenges that I faced was doing I Am a Man while I was on tenure track. And it wasn't because it wasn't because it wasn't scholarly. It was because of the subject matter itself. So everyone who knows, like, who's looked up my work, know that when I was at MIT, there was nothing culturally, dare I say, there was nothing about the African-American community or anything in my PhD work. And I think for Black scholars, oftentimes when we deal with subjects like this, we get pigeonholed very quickly. And they're like, oh, that makes sense. You do that type of work. So it was a huge risk for me to do a piece like I'm a Man and not all of a sudden become labeled as, oh, that's the guy who does Black VR narratives. So it was interesting that at the time that I built I Am a Man, I was also innovating in my lab of interaction. And I remember presenting to Oculus after they had funded I Am a Man, having a conversation with them about my new peripheral. And they just kind of took a step back. They were like, oh, you do this too? And that was the risk, because they were very quickly were able to put me in a little labeled box. And I you know, Oculus is a great company. You know, I criticize them, but they've also been helpful for the work I try to do. And so that peripheral that you saw in the image, you know, that's a whole body of work about VR and user interaction. And in my mixed reality lab, there's tons of more things like that we're developing, creating, taking it to our commercialization office, and then trying to commercialize those things. That has nothing to do with my other passion. So for me, the risk, and it's just like that with gender. You know, if you're a woman and you want to take on design issues related to gender and design, all of a sudden people can very quickly label that designer, oh, well, she's just a gender and equity designer. And that becomes a very challenging and risky thing to do, because you are passionate about those things, but clearly you have a lot to offer to the world of design. So that's just my very transparent, like, no one's ever asked me that, but I will say is that, you know, that was a risk to do that and not become marginalized and labeled that's the only thing that you do. And I think with the peripheral device, and Oculus was surprised, and I was able to start working with them and their team of hardware and start working with the peripheral. But it took a convincing. It took them a moment to basically having to rebrand myself for them, because they very quickly said, oh, that's what you do over there. And I think for minorities, that's always a very hard thing, to not be labeled the social activist person to say, we want to do that work. We're passionate about that work, but there's so much more we have to offer to the world of design.
Someone's asking if, actually, I think that's an interesting question. Going back to the experience of VR, like, asks if creating I Am a Man changed your understanding of the story or Martin Luther King, and experience the space in different ways. Like, did it help you, like, think of something differently?
Every historical project I've taken on does that for me, even as an individual. It opens my eyes. And, you know, one thing that Dr. King, he was there for the Poor People's Campaign. He was there not about just, he had done the Voting Rights Act. And I think oftentimes we take Dr. King and we reduce his work to just going after the right to vote and social justice, you know, breaking down Jim Crow. We don't realize that by the time he was there, his whole agenda was against poverty. His whole agenda was the Poor People's Campaign, that it had nothing to do with race at this time. He was like, there's poor people everywhere. We should stop this in America. And then even with this project I'm working on now with Barnstormers, once again, you find these other historical nuggets that are really interesting and complex. The whole story of Negro League Baseball and the integration of Negro League baseball players into the majors like Jackie Robinson, Doby, and all of those. As great as that was, it gutted a complete economic system in the Black community, where Black owners had these baseball teams, Black businesses supported the franchises. There was this huge economic disruption when all of a sudden those players, the best players, were gutted away and taken away into the major league. And then all of a sudden those teams began to collapse. So there's this whole monetary connection too. We can't obviously tell all the stories in VR. And so I always tell people the VR is just one component. It's what happens before you put on the headset, and it's more important, it's what happens after you come out of the headset. The discussions you have with educators, the curriculum that you make, it's never just a one and done thing. So yes, these things have changed me personally. As I continue to build them, I hope they will continue to change other people too.
Someone asks about advice. So what would you advise students, recent graduates who want to take like a similar path to yours and experiment with VR?
You know, experimentation is the critical key. You know, really diving in. You know, it's MIT, so most of the people, you know, you can program. It's still hopefully common. It's less common at other design schools where you find a breadth of people who aren't afraid of scripting languages and playing and experimenting with those spaces. So, you know, I say you start to jump in and begin to learn your tool set. Choosing Unity, choosing the Unreal game engine. There are huge communities out there. But what I find time and time again is that the communities of people who are coming from traditional gaming are bringing that gaming mentality to design. And there's something unique about those like myself who are approaching it from space first and having the architecture as a background, that spatial inquiry first. These projects are much more dynamic spatially and do a lot more things to you emotionally than what we're seeing being created by just the pure gaming industry, translating their work from the screen to a virtual environment. So I would say, you know, find projects that you're passionate about. I know there's from talking with colleagues who are still there, there's a huge now big group of VR developers in the Media Lab that does a competition every spring. I would say get connected to those communities and start experimenting, start building these little things. But more importantly, look for the opportunities to do the other, you know, and the other could be everything from an other type of user experience, an other type of story. Don't get sucked into, oh, everyone it's what we used to tell people in architecture, right? We don't, when I was teaching there, you don't just look at the cover of Architectural Record or look at on the blogs and say, I'm going to make my building exactly like, you know, you let the process drive what you're creating. Don't get sucked in to look at everything and say, oh, I'm going to make a game like Beat Saber. I'm going to make a game like Onward and some of these popular titles. I'd say take a step back, analyze the user experiences, look at these different things, and that's when you begin to create your own new language for not just the story, but how you interact through the piece.
Perhaps this advice to new students is a good way to close. We have a little bit more time if you want to have some ending thoughts. It's just we don't want to exhaust you since we started the discussion early. So if you want to share some last thoughts, up to you.
So I'll say this once again about the being engaged in social justice. We are at a moment right now where we can no longer afford to compartmentalize how we feel about the issues in the world. You know, I went through design school at a time where faculty members actually told us, compartmentalize, put it in a bag. leave it outside the studio. When we come in, we're going to deal with these other things, and don't deal with these other issues. And I think we're just beyond that. We cannot get to a point where we say, you know, issues around violence in this country, issues around equality, issues even around the relationship between policing and communities. We cannot afford to say, well, that's not our problem. That's not what I'm here to do. This kind of purity of being a designer. I think we're first and foremost citizens of the world. And so what I challenge all of my students, and I challenge everyone to start asking yourself, well, what does it first and foremost mean to be a citizen? And how can you then engage with the problems through your craft, through your discipline, through your field? Please don't compartmentalize. If you feel passionate about, and I hope you do, feel passionate about the things that are happening around us, get engaged, do something. Don't put it off and say, hey, you know, that's for a different time and a different place. The time is now, the time for now for meaningful engagement. And I think in the past, we've missed the ball that way. When I say we, academia, and I say we, even the broader design community. So now is the time to get engaged. Now is the time to be proactive, but then to find creative ways to bring your design discipline to the table as a solution for the things that we see around us.
Thank you, Derek. I mean, it's really important to remind everyone and us for our social responsibility as architects, designers, and researchers. Thank you again for the talk, and then I'll pass it on to Nicholas, our head, for the closing remarks.
Thanks so much, Derek. And thanks, Larry, for the introduction. That was an amazing lecture, and I was really, really glad to not only host you tonight, but to kick off our series with it. Thanks also to all of you for coming and joining us in what is admittedly also a virtual space, if one potentially less compelling in its architecture, if not its content, than what Derek showed us tonight. I would like to let everyone know that unfortunately we've had to postpone next week's lecture with Azra Aksamija, but we hope you join us for our following event on Thursday, October 8th at 6 p.m. for a lecture hosted with the Building Technology program. And that lecture is called Designing for Disasters Before They Happen, focused on underserved communities by alumna Veronica Sidios. Then on October 15th, we'll host historian and designer of pandemics, Sarah Jensen-Carr, with Michael Murphy of the Mass Design Group. And they're both collaborating on a COVID-focused studio this fall with John Oxendorf in our department. You can see the full list of upcoming events at architecture.mit.edu. We hope to see you all with us again. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thanks again so much to Derek. We'll have you back with us soon, and maybe in person as well as virtually.